My name is Tom Nightingale. I was born in 1934 in Omaha, Nebraska. My early life was spent in the Midwest, Omaha, Nebraska, Chicago, and then we went to Ohio in 1943 and lived there while Dad worked at an air base. We had when I was in high school back in 1951, we had a friend who was in the National Guard, and he talked to my dad about the possibility of me getting my 8-year obligation completed in the National Guard there in Ohio. So I joined the Guard in April of '51 and enjoyed it, went to the weekly drill, and the only military aspiration I had at the time was a naval ROTC contact, but that never panned out. So when I joined the National Guard, went to the drills during the summer. We went to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin for the 2-week training there. I thought this was fun. I was 16 at the time, so that was quite an adventure. When I graduated from high school in June of '51, the Army was pretty well decimated, and they alerted us that we may go on active duty shortly. And in August of '51, we were informed that in January we would be going on active duty. By happenstance, I joined a medical company. It was a medical company of the 147th Infantry, part of the Ohio National Guard. And it just worked out that I was a corpsman at the time, although I had no medical training, obviously. But I had the MOS of a corpsman, whatever it was, back in the 1950s. And after we were activated in January of '52, we went to Fort Polk, Louisiana. We actually opened up Camp Polk at that time. It had been closed after World War II. And we had the cadre status, basically, and we were filled in with recruits to bring us up to the full strength of what the 37th Division would normally be. I was still in a medical company, so I didn't do much infantry training. Mostly it was time spent learning about setting up an aid station and being a corpsman. After completing my medical training at Sam Houston, I was back playing corpsman duty with the infantry at Fort Polk. And in August of '52, I came out on orders. Then somebody noticed I wasn't 18 yet, so I was pulled off of orders until my birthday came and went on August 20th. Then in September, I came out on orders again to go to Korea, and this time it was for real. So I went on my 30-day R&R home to get ready for the trip before I went to Korea. After I had my 30 days at home for leave, I went over to Wright-Patterson Air Base and basically hitchhiked out to California. I remember going from Dayton, Ohio to Omaha to a big Strategic Air Command base. I don't remember the planes, but they were all huge at the time, mostly bombers and that type of plane. Hitchhiked all the way out to somewhere in Nevada. Then I had to go commercial from there to California. Arrived at Camp Stoneman late in September, early October of '52, and waited there a few days in the Repo Depot, and then moved on to USS Buckner, going to Yokohama. Spent 10 days on the Buckner, and that was an adventure. As we got near Japan, a typhoon was coming, and we turned around and went back out in the open ocean for 3 more days. And that prolonged our trip a bit. After I got to Yokohama, I was put on a list for the 7th Division, and I don't remember being assigned to the 17th at that time, but we went on to a base near Pusan, where I was assigned to the 17th Infantry.
Oh, okay.
At that time, I was still a PFC, and after the depot in Pusan, they assigned me to the 17th, which was down in Koji Do doing the prisoner of war duty at that time. So they put us on a little boat, and we went over to Koji Do. That was in early November of '52, because I remember my first Thanksgiving away from home was there at the camp with the prisoners of war. The first person I met there was a Corporal Guidry. He was the chief medic for Able Company. I spent no time at the company headquarters, no time at the aid station, just directly out to the infantry unit where I stayed the whole time. At that time, we were in tents with wooden floors and oil heat. So we had some degree of comfort. The medics were in the back half of the medic tent. We had blankets across. We had an aid station up front, and the medic bunk in the back. Most of the time there, I just got to know the troop, wandered around with them. They did their guard duty on and off and did whatever training they did, but I didn't really take part in any of it, just observed. It was a pretty good life for a medic. And we spent Thanksgiving there. Then in December, we packed up and moved over to the port where we got on LST and went up to Incheon and had a landing there. And from that point, I believe I was a corporal by that time, we moved on inland to the area around Camp Casey, and then eventually up to online position around T-Bone, and we set up camp there. Okay, coming online was quite an adventure. Remember now, I'm still 18 years old, and all of this is a big adventure to me. I didn't know enough to be afraid of anything at that time. It seems like we spent a lot of time rotating between positions on the main line, in bunker, trenches, and on outpost duty. We rotated quite frequently, it seems like. The adventure of it all seemed to just overcast. I wasn't afraid of anything. It was all fun, basically, to me, just watching everything happen. When we finally got into real activity, it was on T-Bone. I remember very vividly the nighttime duties there. We would go out on patrol routinely. I forget what the rule was, but if you had a combat patrol, they had to have a medic go with them. And of course, we were always short a medic, so I seemed to go out almost every night on a patrol. It was cold. We had our field jacket, we had our heavy boot, and the Mickey Mouse boot, and plenty of long underwear and sweater, so I was comfortable in that regard. But it was still cold, and the bunkers were not heated, of course. I had a bunker in one of the back trenches where I kept my gear most of the time. Although I was never there, I spent all my time up with the infantry soldiers in their bunkers. And of course, they had the open firing port, so it was always cold in their bunker. We had a little pit in the ground where we could keep fires going to heat up our ration. But life was okay.
Just go for a second. Go ahead.
Okay, while we were on line, I was with the 1st Platoon of Able Company. The only platoon leader I remember was a Lieutenant Starr. And in his prior life, he'd been a grocer. So we chatted quite a bit back then, but here I am 18 years old with the adult, so I didn't have a whole lot to contribute. But it was a lot of fun. Got to know the guy pretty well. When we went out on patrol, it was always a matter of having a BAR man stand behind me. And here I was, all of 5'10" and 150 pounds, carrying a litter and my aid bag. And we carried a sleeping bag to carry the wounded off in. So I had plenty of gear to carry. I never carried a weapon at this time. When we went out on patrol, I would always be about the middle of the pack. And we went to set up a listening patrol, and I would just go out there and watch the rocket shell, the flares that they fired off. Didn't see any of the enemy for quite a while that I was aware of. Most of the time it was listening patrol, not combat patrol. The first time I remember getting a casualty was while we were on T-Bone. An American patrol had gotten caught in a minefield down in the valley. And one of the poor guys had set off one of the napalm mines that were planted around there and gotten burned. We saw the flare go off when the man tripped the grenade and set off the napalm, and heard the scream. And I grabbed a couple of the other guys and we went down to get him. It was kind of a stupid thing to do, but from where we were on the hill, we knew where the minefield was. We could see the tape, so I had an idea where I was going. And I went down with a couple of the guys, and we had a sleeping bag and a litter, and my aid kit. We put the guy in the sleeping bag, and at that time we used a little heater, a palm heater. You would light it and throw it in the sleeping bag to give the fellow some warmth. And we did that, and we evacuated him. We got him up to the position where we could have a litter party carry him on back. When I got back up to the hill, the lieutenant was very annoyed because I'd gone out there without his permission. Somehow it never occurred to me that I had to ask for permission to go get somebody wounded. But that was my first casualty that I really dealt with. Okay. The minefield had been marked off pretty well from where we were up on top of the hill, so I knew where to go. And it was really something where I never really gave it a thought about any danger of other mines. It was our minefield, obviously, and so I felt comfortable going after him. I don't remember whatever happened to the fellow. Of course, you lose track of them once you set them off on their way back with the litter party. But that was my first casualty to deal with. After that, we had minor things on the hill. The patrols that we went on to were mostly listening patrols. The combat patrols we went out on, we would go until we drove fire and then come back. So we had no casualties on any of those, so I was just there as an observer for the most part. In the afternoon, we would have a meeting in the lieutenant's bunker about the patrol for that night. We'd get our objective, get out the map, and look at where we wanted to go, what the purpose of it was, either observation, listening, or a firefight. Then just about sundown, we'd head out through the wire, going over the line and down out of the trench line, down the trail, trying to be quiet, although I'm sure they could see us because we were surrounded by higher hills, Baldy and all the others, so they observed everything we did, obviously. But we went out and tried to be stealthy about it. By the time we got down into the valley, it would usually be dusk and everything was getting dark. We'd move on out to our position we were heading for. I remember sitting in one of the Patty there on a listening patrol, and while we were there, the ice froze around us. It was quiet going out because everything was just wet, but coming back we had the ice on the water, it crunched. And of course everybody's saying be quiet. Well, it's kind of hard to be quiet when you're walking on thin ice. But we were pretty lucky. We had a lot of time to sit there and watch the flare, watch the artillery shells going both ways. Most of the time it didn't seem like there was that much artillery. It was more harassment type. But we watched it and kept in touch with my troop. It seemed like we rotated back between line position and then a rear area, which is Camp Casey, and then outpost duty. It seemed like we spent an awful lot of time on outpost duty. And the first time we really ran into enemy action was when the Chinese were doing some probing around T-Bone. This would have been probably late February, early March. Most of it was little harassment type of patrolling that they did. I remember we quite often would have little skirmishes with the outpost people, or the listening post, I guess more exactly. And I'd be in the bunker line there watching things happen. When the firefight began, there'd be some incoming shells too, a lot of hand grenades, small arms fire. At this time I wasn't aware of any real calling of artillery or anything like that. Although it may have happened, I just didn't really pay attention to it. When the Chinese got close enough to inflict casualties, that was usually pretty chaotic because you got guys screaming medic and you've got the firefighting going on, you're not quite sure where to go. And as a medic, you're always by yourself. You don't have a group of people going out with you to find the wounded. You just head to them. But it was a patrol activity on their part that was our first combat, really, where I saw people getting shot, grenade casualties, in March of '52. When we had casualties, we were always short-handed medics. Ideally, we would have had 2 medics with each platoon, but the whole time I was there, we never had 2. I was always by myself. I stayed with the 1st Platoon of Able Company the whole time. When we had casualties, if they were able to walk, I would walk them down to the bottom of the hill to a checkpoint where we could get them onto a litter and get them taken out by other people. I had no idea who these were. They were either military or Katusha people. But the troop would help me if I needed to evacuate a casualty. At this time, I'm weighing 130, 150 pounds, so I wasn't doing much heavy lifting. And of course, you get a boy's marking hell with a BAR, he's topping out at somewhere in 200 pounds. If he got hurt, you had to have help to get him out of there. A few of the casualties were grenade-type wounds, shrapnel, some rifle fire. An awful lot of it seemed to be more debris that was kicked up, and then the shrapnel and the rocks and all would cut the people. I don't really recall having many serious casualties during the early part of the battle on T-Bone. Most of it was skirmish activity on their part. When I finally made it through to March 29th, they were digging out a gun emplacement at the top of the hill for a recoilless rifle. And of course, it had to have the open field in front and the recoil field in the back. It was a wide open trough, basically. While they were digging it out, they had some incoming artillery shells. And of course, somebody hollered medic, and I ran over there as quick as I could. And I got there and was talking. It had been a good scare, and it dusted up a couple of the guys, but nobody was really wounded. while we were there talking, we had more shells come in, and we had a couple of the guys wounded. That's where I was wounded the first time. The mortar shell landed right in front of me, and I caught most of it, neck, stomach, and leg. One of the other guys there was wounded, and I asked about him. Not that I could do much about him. I was standing there spurting blood out my neck, and it was pretty obvious that I wasn't going to be much help to anybody. So they began the evacuation for me and got one of the other medics to come from around on the other side of the hill and took care of me at the time. Okay. It was about 10:30 on March 29th in the morning when the shells came in to the location where they were digging out the trench. And after I got there, I was there just in time to catch a mortar. It landed right in front of me. It hit me in the neck, stomach, and leg. I was bleeding quite badly out the neck. The uniform at the time was a flak jacket, which thank God I did have on, so I was protected from my waist up to my neck. Then, after I was hit, I went paralyzed on the left side of my body from the shell that went into my neck. It hit a nerve bundle up there. And the people helped me down off the hill. We stumbled and staggered down from the top of T-bone to a flat area on the back side of the hill. Got on the litter at that point. One of the medics put a bandage around my neck. The leg and stomach shots were okay. They didn't need any bandaging really. So they let that go. And they basically dragged me down off the hill on that litter. I was trying to hold on as well as I could, and they were manhandling me down. Again, glad I wasn't very fat, so they were able to handle that pretty well. We got down to the bottom of the hill, and they had a collecting point there. They put my litter on the Jeep and drove me back to the aid station. That seemed like about a 30-minute trip, although it probably wasn't near that long. When we got to the aid station, they checked my wound. They bandaged up my leg. Then they put me on a helicopter. It was kind of a neat ride, except for the fact I was going to freeze to death. Everybody piled 2 or 3 blankets on top, but nobody thought to put any blankets underneath. When you got on that helicopter pad, you're out there on the little pod, and they've got the plastic cover over your face, and I was never so cold in my life. That was horrible. And I stayed awake through the helicopter ride back to the MASH unit. When we got to the MASH, I remember being taken off of the helicopter, and as we went into the MASH unit, I blacked out. And at that time, everything just got black, and then the next thing I knew, I was on a cloud looking down. And I remember being very annoyed because they wouldn't stop. I could see one group at my neck and one down in my belly, and I wanted them to stop what they were doing. But for some reason, they wouldn't do it. And I don't know how long that went on, but I'd actually gotten to see my flashback of the family. My grandparents had been dead for years, my mother and all people like that. Then I finally came to on March 1st, or April 1st. I was out from the 29th to the 1st. I remember waking up in this room. It seemed very dark, and it was like a barracks with a row of beds with all the wounded on it. And they eventually got me up and had me walk the first time then. That was awful. It felt like my belly was going to fall out of me. I had a 12-inch scar in the middle of my stomach. So they obviously had repaired a lot of intestinal damage. And after a couple of days there, they put me on a bus and they hauled me down to an evacuation hospital. And by this time I was conscious and able to take light food. Wasn't doing any particular walking around. My stomach was all bandaged up. The wound in the gut actually had been closed with wire suture. And every time you moved, the wire caught on the abdominal bandage. So that was very painful. And it turned out later, I found out I had received 13 units of blood during the operation. So I had a lot to be thankful for. At this time, my left side of my body had come back. I could feel things. I lost the feeling in 3 fingers in my right hand from the nerve damage. But other than that, it worked out pretty well. A few days at the evacuation hospital. Then they put us on a train. I have no idea where we went to, but it was a collecting point again with another little hospital. And from there, they air evac'd us back to Tokyo. Everything I'm looking at then is from a litter, so I have no idea where I was at the time. I do remember the train ride on the litter. Everybody was taking pretty good care of us. We had nurses by this time. We never had any Okay, eventually we made it back to Tokyo Army Hospital. While I was there, I couldn't have been there maybe 4 or 5 days, and they took out the metal suture from my stomach wound. And that was such a wonderful thing, because every time you moved with the metal, it would hang up on the abdominal dressing and rip you apart. Once they took the stitches out, I was able to go get a shower. I remember going into the shower room, and the nurse would send people in to see if I was okay. It felt so good to have warm, clean water. I must have been in there for an hour anyway. And that was delightful. And I was ambulatory at that time, and still had my meals brought to me at the bed. While I was there, other soldiers from the Able Company, 17th, were coming through. This was from the early battle on Pork Chop in April of '53. And so I saw all my buddies coming in there and got to chat with them a bit. I was there for probably 2 weeks. Then they felt I was well enough to leave and went over to a recuperation camp. Basically, it was just a barrack where we sort of had a pretty nice life. I did a lot of walking. They did dental checkup and all this for your general health. And they gave you time to become ambulatory and build up your strength. At that point, I did not have any of the soldiers from the 17th with me. I was just kind of on my own. But after I was there a while, they decided that I could go back to the state and finish my recuperation there. But I had the urge to go back to my unit. So I told them that I voluntarily requested to return to Able Company 17th. And after a few days, they cut orders, and sure enough, on the order, it said I was reassigned to Able Company of the 17th. When the fellows from the 17th were coming into Tokyo Army to join me, it became obvious that they'd had a major battle on Pork Chop in April, and they were telling about it. I don't remember much of the details of it, other than the fact that most of them described it as pretty uncomfortable. Again, 18 years old, what do you know about uncomfortable? Okay. When they finally cut the order for me, I was very happy to be going back to the 17th. This would have been probably at least the end of May, and I thought it was a rather neat thing to be able to go back to my unit and join my buddies again. Although I should have realized by this time the buddies had all rotated out, so I wasn't going to return to many that I really knew. But it was still what I felt was the right thing to do. So, after I made my way back from Japan, it seemed I was on my own pretty much. I had orders, and they just said, you know, keep going this way. And I joined the 17th in a reserve capacity. By this time, of course, all the troops that I had known had rotated out or been wounded. So while they were in the reserve being replenished and restocked, I joined them there. By this time, I would have been the senior medic. The other medic from the earlier battle, of course, had either been wounded or rotated. So I was the only one there who had actually been involved in any kind of combat action. And this would have been probably in June of '53, maybe early June. When I got there and came through the medical company, my assignment was to be the senior medic with Able Company, and I went on up and joined them in that capacity. That meant I stayed primarily with the weapons platoon and the company headquarters group, or the platoon, whichever platoon was most active, I would go with them at that time. But that was it. Early in July, with Able Company in the 17th, we moved back up on line to Pork Chop Hill. We took up the position there. I was primarily on the left side of the hill. Being the senior medic, I didn't really have a group of guys that I was responsible for. The weapon platoon people were back on the main line. They obviously didn't take the mortar up onto the hill with them. They were back on the main line to provide cover. So when we went on the hill, I stayed in a bunker on the back side of the hill at the unloading point. It was a good location for me because where the personnel carriers came, made their stop, we were under cover. We had railroad ties and all the heavy stuff on top of them for cover. And you went in about 12 feet, and there was a bunker at the end of the corridor-like place. If you went to the left, you went into the bunker, and just before you got to that point, if you went right, you went into the main trench line on the western side of the hill. So I was in that bunker with two other fellows. I can't remember for the life of me what they were or who they were. But the sad fact of it was that none of us carried weapons. So we stayed in that bunker. During the daytime, I would go out and go around and visit with the troops, check on them, take care of any little problems that there were. There were medics with the platoon, but I couldn't tell you who they were to this day. But if you were a medic, you just took care of whatever troops needed. We stayed in that bunker at night, the three of us. We had a poncho or a blanket over the door to keep it dark. We didn't have any real power anyway. We had candle power, and that was about it for nighttime use. But we stayed there. When the battle actually began on the night of on July 6th, we were in the bunker, and the artillery shell started falling a little more heavily. And to get from our position up to the main line, we went through an open area of the trench. It wasn't all covered over in the back part of the hill. So we stayed in that bunker when the artillery shell came in. About 10:30 at night, We had grenades thrown into the bunker with it. And thank goodness they were more of a concussion type grenade than our good old American pineapple grenade, because the one fellow with me was hit in the face a bit. I caught some shrapnel in the lower part of my leg, and that was about it for me. But we could hear the Chinese talking on top of it. And after they threw in a couple grenades, they didn't bother to come into the bunker, thankfully. So the three of us stayed there quiet as little bunnies during that part of the night. We could hear the Chinese out there talking, and we didn't want to make any noise to alert them to the fact that we were still alive and or that we were even there. I put a bandage on the one fellow's face in the dark. I had no idea what his injuries were, but just went ahead and did that to keep him from bleeding anymore. And then we basically just hunkered down there, stayed quiet. The artillery shells kept falling. We could hear rifle fire, shout, talk, but we didn't want to make a sound. Finally, about 2 or 2:30 in the morning, we heard a shout. It was an American voice yelling, "Who's in charge?" And after a few minutes of back and forth talk, where you're from, who you're with, I told them it was Able Company of the 17th was in charge. Who were they? They yelled back, Baker Company. Who's pitching for the Yankees now? Where's your hometown? Who's the mayor of New York? Things, trying to make sure that we were all American and not Chinese who just spoke English. We bantered back and forth a few minutes, and finally, the people out there said, "Well, if that's who you are, come on out." And I seemed to be the one that was mobile. I got up and went out. And I've never been so scared in my life as when I went out of that bunker and through that short trench to where the personnel carrier landing was. And there were soldiers out there crouched down with their rifles. Their M1s looked like they were cannons at that time when I was looking into it. Just absolutely terrified. But we talked a few minutes, and they figured out I was an American, I guess, so they moved on. And they began from that point to enter the trench line to go to the western side of the hill. And some of them continued on over to the right side to the east, where there was another point of entry to the trench line. As they began to go up the hill and get into firefight, wounded would start coming back, and they'd tell me that there were more wounded up there, so I'd go on up and get whatever I could and bring them back. And I made a collecting point there in the bunker. I figured as long as the troops were coming onto the hill at that point and moving up into the main trench line, that would be a pretty good place for a collecting point. So that's what I did. And I stayed there with the troop and go out and get occasional ones. And when the personnel carrier started coming up, we would offload the wounded, put them on the personnel carrier and get them out of there. After we were there a while, a fellow came up, I have no idea of rank, nobody wore any rank, of course. And he told me I had to get out of the bunker, they needed it. And we dickered a few minutes, and here I was, all of 18 and 150 pounds, and standing my ground, I told him no, this was a collecting point for the wounded, and that until he got shot, he should get the hell out of there. Once he was wounded, he was welcome back. And after a bit, he left. A short time later, another guy came in, and he told me to pack up and get out. And we talked a few minutes, and I was standing my turf. I wasn't about to go anywhere. So we haggled a bit, and he left. A little bit later, another man came in, and he asked what the problem was. And I told him there was no real problem. This was just where I'd established a collecting point for the wounded. Here I could hold them until they were ready to be evacuated. When they went out of this bunker, they were undercover until they got on the personnel carrier, so they wouldn't be hit by the fire again. And he said that sounds reasonable. Later I found out that was Colonel Reed. He'd come up to establish a command bunker there, and he did. The bunker was big enough that we could have probably 10, 12 wounded in it, 3 or 4 litters and some sitting around. So I was able to keep the people there. We had food brought up a bit. We had 1 thermite container of coffee that was brought up pretty early on, so everybody had that. It was a good location for the troop because they were secured there, and I felt like that was what we owed them at least. Once they were hit, they shouldn't be exposed to fire again. As the battle progressed, of course, they used flash fire, which was the proximity fuses, and when our troops were out in the open, just like everybody else, they got hit by it too. So we had quite a few casualties come from that. Every now and then I'd go out and get somebody, and a lot of them were brought back by either their buddies or the infantry, or they found their own way back. Okay. At this time, the Chinese were still all over the hill, and they were intermingled with our guys, so you could never tell quite who was whom. And some of the trench line had been caved in by the mortar shell and the artillery shell, and the firing was pretty heavy. At one time, me too.
I know it is. That's why you're doing that. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. At this time, the firefighting got to be pretty heavy. The Chinese were all over the hill, and they were intermingled with our guys, so you could never tell who was in a particular bunker or location. So when you went out, the thing was to keep your head down. I never carried a weapon, so I had no way of doing anything if I'd run into a Chinese soldier. But I did go out and get a few, and the fellows would wander back, and they would bring their buddies back with them if they were wounded. So it worked out well having the collecting station. The artillery fire seemed to come and go, and I know that Colonel Reed called in flash fire several times, and after that there would always be a rush of wounded because they were out in the open, and the shells didn't discriminate Korean or Chinese or American. So we had quite a few casualties then. We had body bags brought up, not enough of them unfortunately. And what I did was stack the dead out in front of the doorway. It was still protected. Basically you stacked them up like cordwood. If we had body bags, we put them in them, but if you didn't, you just stacked them there. Years later, it was odd because Jim McKenzie mentioned in one phone conversation that when he came on the hill, and first thing he ran into was the bodies stacked up. He said that image bothered him for years. But it was a good place to collect the bodies. When the personnel carriers came, we would evacuate the troop with the most severe first. We never put wounded and dead on the same personnel carrier. Didn't think that'd be quite right. So if we had a lull in the action, we would evacuate all the bodies that we could. It seemed like there were always more of them than we had room for. So there was always a pile out in front of the doorway. The casualties were pretty bad. There were a lot of gunshots, some amputations, limbs blown off, and that type of thing. One of the things I always remember is the fact that the American GI is a pretty stoic character. I carried morphine all the time. I think the 2.5 days, whatever it was, I was on the hill, I only used a few of the morphine stylets. Usually the troops were happy if they just had some comfort, somebody to talk to them. a cigarette, maybe some coffee. And that was all they demanded. They didn't need a lot of pain medication. Most of them were still in shock, I guess. So that would account for part of it. But most of the time, they just laid there and waited their turn. That's pretty remarkable. Our medical care at that time, of course, was pretty primitive. We were out there with nothing but a bag full of bandages. We would do triage, basically, and take care of the ones that were the most serious. Stop the bleeding first was the rule, and then do whatever else we could to make them comfortable. If we had to splint them up, we would do that. Most of the time, we'd have a broken weapon to use for a splint. Just tie the barrel of the weapon alongside the arm and secure it tightly. A few times we'd get troops who came in and died there in the aid station. Probably glad I was young then. It didn't have the emotional impact it would have today. But when they quit breathing and quit bleeding, if you couldn't find a pulse, you couldn't give them respiration to get them breathing again. You covered their eyes and moved them out into the open trench there to stack up. That was a lot of responsibility for an 18-year-old kid, wasn't it? But it was probably a good thing I was 18 because I didn't know enough to be emotionally involved with much of it. But we collected the wounded and tried to keep them together, the ones that weren't too seriously injured, up toward the front of the bunker where there was some activity. Colonel Reed did have people coming in. That was his command post, although he never had that many people hanging around him. He kept it pretty minimum, and it was very supportive. We'd chat occasionally, and a lot of the troops came and went around there, and some of them would get minor wounds, and we'd patch them up, and of course they had to go back to their duty. They didn't want to be evacuated for anything minor. Most of them were pretty gutsy young men. Talk about after effects if you want. Okay. During this time, the personnel carriers were bringing up primarily ammunition, supplies for the troops. They would bring up some food. We had that thermite container of coffee that we dished out. I think everybody shared the same canteen cup as we went around, and by the time the 2 days were up, that container of coffee was pretty well empty and pretty strong and pretty cold. So it wasn't much in the way of comfort food. We did have other supplies coming up. I never had enough body bags. They kept bringing up the bandages we needed, the medical supplies. Actually started very few IVs up there. Back then we were primarily using albumin in a 500 milliliter bottle. We would use that occasionally to start an IV, but we didn't do that many. The primary thing at that time was stop the bleeding and protect the wound. And that's what we did up on the hill. Other medics came up. One of them was Jim McKenzie. He was with, I think, Easy Company. When he came on the hill, he stopped in the bunker a bit, and we chatted a little bit, and he moved on up to the west side of or to the east of the hill with where Lieutenant Shea and Dale Kane and those people were. And he would come back occasionally with some wounded. But we stayed there the whole time. My wounds were not bad, so it didn't interfere with anything. Mostly little shrapnel in the leg. During that time, we had a couple of the Chinese wounded come back through. I don't think they got much tender, loving care before they got to me, but we did have a couple of them come in wounded. We patched them up, and they went out with our guys. They were so badly wounded they didn't need any kind of guard or handcuffing or any of that treatment. But that's all there were. Most of them were the Americans, and they a lot of gunshot and that sort of thing. But where did we go? During that time on the hill, Colonel Reed was in the bunker with us, and other commanders too. But years later, I read the book about the general coming up and going around the hill, but I wasn't aware of any of that. But when the firefighting was going on, if the wounded were out there and needed to be brought back, I went out and got them. And eventually, that's what I got the Silver Star for, going out and retrieving the wounded. The bunker lines were pretty well collapsed in by that time on the part of the hill where I was located. And when I went up, the trenches sort of got filled in, caved in, whatever, and we're out in the open quite a bit. And that's what the medal came for. It was funny, years later, I called Colonel Reed one day. I guess I'm sorry, I just blew it on you. Okay. When the battle was going on, Colonel Reed was there and we chatted. And finally, when it was decided to pull the 17th Regiment off, or the 1st Battalion of 17th, Colonel Reed told me that I would come off the hill with him. And so I did, and we turned over the maintenance of the bunker to the other people, and finally came off with Colonel Reed in what I guess was about the end of the Able Company group, although I later found out there were other Able Company people that stayed on the hill in another location. After we got back into the rear area, they had the award ceremony, and Colonel Reed pinned the Silver Star on me. And that was memorable. When the battle was going on, I would be aware of the fact that Colonel Reed was calling in the VT fire, and the pace of the shelling picked up at that time. Then after they would do it for a period of time, 5, 10, 15 minutes, there would be casualties out there. We could tell because they would straggle back, and I would go out of the bunker. We had the overhead compartment in front of our bunker itself, and once you went out of that, you were into the trench line, but the trench line in many places had been collapsed by the artillery fire, and bunkers had been collapsed. So you went out and you crawled around them, tried to keep low, tried to make sure that you weren't hit, obviously. But I would go around to the front part of the hill, the north part of it actually, is where the main action was. And there would be enclaves or groups of troops out there. Soldiers would be huddling together, have a firing point, or what was left of a bunker, where they would have a firing area set up, and they would keep their activity going from there. And it was maybe a distance of maybe 20 yards up to where the trench line would have been intact in the old days, but it collapsed. We were on top of the hill and couldn't get into most of the bunkers. A lot of them had been caved in, or we didn't know who was in them. If the Americans knew that there were Americans in a bunker, we could go into it, but other than that, we did not just wander around through bunkers. Didn't know who was in them. When you go out on these little forays, you would see bodies lying around. The American bodies were hauled back. The Chinese were left in place. And there were places where you could tell there'd been a battle or particularly pitched area, and there would be a cluster of bodies there. Places where it looked like a mortar shell had come in and wiped out a group of people. 4, 5, 10 bodies piled around the area. We were very good about keeping the American bodies policed up and brought back. And I don't think we left any in our area of the hill that I know of. There may have been some in the bunkers, and there probably were, there were none left on top of the hill where you could see them. We were pretty good about that. Of course, during the time after Pork Chop, while we were in the rear area, light firing kept going on. We kept hearing about the peace talks going on, but they'd been dragging on for so long that nobody paid a whole lot of attention to them. Finally, we heard there was going to be an armistice at the end of July, and we were in a back area at the time. I remember we were on the back side of a hill in a bunker that had been fitted out pretty well by this time, and it was a collecting area for the troops, and we were there. It was 10 o'clock at night when the armistice took effect. I remember there was firing right up to that time, and there were flares going off. We could still see them. We could hear the artillery shells, more of a harassment type of firing, and flares continuously, so you'd know what was out there. And then at 10 o'clock, the artillery fire stopped. I remember going out and just standing there and looking up at the sky. There were flares, but there were no shells falling after that. I thought that was pretty nice to hear that quiet finally. Land in the midnight calm, and there it was finally. So that was pretty neat. Okay. In the year 2000, we went to the 17th Infantry reunion at Columbus, Georgia. That was my first time with the regiment in Korea, and we enjoyed the time with the troops. At the banquet, Maggie and I were there, and Dale Kane was there also. Dale had been on the eastern half of the hill with Lieutenant Shea, and I noticed the name tag, Able Company, and the fact that he was there in 1952, and we got talking about it. And I asked Dale to help me clarify a point. I said that my recollection was 11 people came off the hill from Able Company. Is that about right? And he shook his head and he said, no, there were only 8. And he had come off after I went off with Colonel Reed. He was over on the eastern half of the hill, which was a separate battle for all purposes, from what I knew. And he had come off actually a day later when they finally got the word to those people that Able Company had been pulled off and the 17th was moving out. So he came off later. That was kind of neat to visit with him. By this time, he had been a highway patrolman, I believe, out in Arizona, and he was then retired. But we chatted about it a few minutes. But he was with Lieutenant Shea on the eastern part of the hill. Lieutenant Shea, of course, got the Medal of Honor for his action over there, but I don't remember Lieutenant Shea at all.